put it on first. It won't clash with this one. Yeah. All right, I think we can start. A very good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking about disaster risk management systems that Africa has, particularly when it comes to food security and securing the lives and livelihoods of Africans. My name is Doreen Apollos. I'll be facilitating this press briefing by the Africa Risk Capacity. It's a specialized agency of the African Union that is best placed to plan, prepare, and respond to weather vagaries as well as natural disasters. I will invite the Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity, Mr. Ibrahima Cheikh Diong, who will give us a brief, and then after that, we will open the floor for further interaction.
Well, thank you very much, Doreen, for that introduction. Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for coming. In the true tradition of the African Union, bonjour, bon dia, assalamu alaikum, habari, as we do it at the African Union. What I want to do on this briefing before I get into the African risk capacity, to make 3 points. One, just to give you some of the takeaway of the African Climate Summit that took place in Nairobi and what it means for Africa. And then second, say a few words about COP28 that took place in Dubai, the key commitment made in Dubai, what it also means for the continent. And obviously spend some time and talk about the impact on the continent, particularly with regard to what we do at the African Risk Capacity. I think for the Climate Summit, for some of you who were fortunate enough like me to be in Nairobi, it was seen to be the first in the African way preparing for international event by bringing Africans, policymakers, decision makers, private sector, public sector in one place with the sole purpose of actually underscoring the African voice before we went to Dubai. And I think many of us who were in Nairobi felt the conference really achieved its goal in making sure that Africa go to these international conferences with one voice in terms of our perspective, our concerns, and if you read the declaration, you can see that Africa was very clear in terms of what we want from the international community. And just to give you some highlights, I think number one, Africa wanted the rest of the world to recognize we contribute only less than 4% to climate change, but yet we see the impact on the continent in terms of the negative impact on flooding and drought and tropical cyclones. So therefore, it's very important that responsibility and accountability is felt as we go to these international meetings, so Africa doesn't fair the burden of something that I have not created. I think second, Africa made it very clear that it is extremely critical that we find a way to actually balance our development objective, but also meeting the climate change requirements. We have resources across the continent in Africa. I believe we can develop those resources in a much sustainable way and not make the same mistake that the West has made when it comes to climate change. I think the third concern of Africa is to make sure that the global financial architecture is reformed to the way that access to financing for Africa is much easier, much affordable. So therefore, it's important that there is no need of having financial commitment that are difficult to access for Africans, so therefore Africa made the case about those reforms to actually take place as soon as possible. And I think last but not least, climate change is not just about problem, it's also about the green revolution, the green economy, and the opportunity it creates in terms of creating jobs for African countries, but also for the youth in particular, but also for that opportunity to be seized by Africa. Obviously, we have to make sure we provide the necessary incentive to make sure that private sector can get into the climate change and green economy. So I think that statement itself, at least many of us went to Dubai, felt there is a piece of paper that Africa said, this is our statement in terms of what we feel, what we're concerned about, and I encourage all of you to read that statement because it says in black and white what Africa wants from the rest of the world. Now, second, the question is, what came out of COP28 and what does it mean for Africa? For some of you who attended COP27 in Egypt, Africa made it very clear it is extremely critical that the world comes together and commit financing to creating what we call the Lost and Damaged Fund. And that is the fund that is geared toward making sure the negative impact of climate change on the continent. We provide resources to make sure we can make sure no one is left behind, particularly the most vulnerable communities. Now, I have to admit that being at COP27, when this is being proposed, many countries thought were doubtful to actually push that type of instrument because it shows the responsibility, sense of guilt in some of the developed countries, and they were pushing back. But the good news at COP28, for the first time, we got not only commitment, but the international community is now committed to making sure that fund become operational as soon as possible to make sure we can build resilience not only in Africa, but in developing countries as well. Now, there was a commitment of about $600 million at COP28. I hope that over the next couple of months, there will be billions of dollars actually on the way to make sure we can provide sufficient funding, obviously, to loss and damage. Second, the board of the loss and damage is being set up, and we hope by June they will obviously have a fund fully operational and funding hopefully accessible to organizations like ourselves. The last point I want to make is about what does that mean for organizations like us? Number one, as Doreen alluded to, we are created by the African Union with the sole purpose of helping our member states to build the capacity to plan better, prepare themselves better, but also to respond to the negative effect of climate change. So therefore, what it means is need to empower existing African institutions to make sure what we do on behalf of Africa is done in a much faster way, scaled up financing so we can actually reach as many people as possible. So I think that's the number one benefit that we expect, to make sure organizations like ourselves continue to do what we do and do it massively across Africa. Second impact that I expect, as many of you know, one of the things that's extremely important in disaster management, to make early warning system accessible to policymakers. This is when there is a flood, you don't wait till the flood happens to begin to actually see what you're going to do with the flood. So early warning system provide the information to policymakers to make decisions early enough to be able to avoid the most vulnerable people being affected. So therefore, whether it is drought, tropical cyclone, and flood, we hope with the Loss and Damage Fund will make early warning system mainstream accessible across Africa. I think second is also going to help us to build our capacity, what we call contingency planning. And that is to make sure that within our governments, we have the capabilities to anticipate on this disaster before they happen. So we hope the Loss and Damage Fund will provide additional resources for us to do that type of work across Africa. Third, it's going to help us also to provide what we call innovative financing. In this case of ARC, we'll rely on the insurance market to generate additional resources so we can respond adequately to disasters. But there are many other innovative tools that we can use: solidarity funding, contingency funding. And all these other funding are equally important to make sure that our African governments don't get caught by surprise when there's a disaster. So hopefully Loss and Damage Fund will help us to do more of that. And last but not least, equally important, it is extremely critical when that fund is available, there's a proper coordination within the African continent whereby we don't find ourselves basically confusing the rest of the world about what we want. So it's really important that organizations like the African Union, our mother organization, continue to play the role of coordination to make sure the resources are directed to where they need it so that no one is left behind. So as a summary, an African Climate Summit that shows Africa means business. We're leading our own exercise. COP28 to come up with some concrete, tangible outcome, and Africa ready to make sure we can build and plan and prepare and respond to disaster wherever they happen in the continent, so no one is left behind. So let me stop there, Doreen, but that's what I want to convey as messages.
Thank you, DG. Before I open the floor to the press, probably I'll ask you to elaborate on, we want to put a face to this conversation. And when we talk about impact and the work of the Africa Risk Capacity and the member states that you have, what is the impact of the work that you have supported so far?
Well, let's take a sector like drought in Africa. When there is actually a rain deficit in most of our countries, it leads to basically what we call food insecurity, simply because the farmers don't have enough water to actually grow whatever they want to grow, support themselves, support their families. So if you wait for that drought to happen, unfortunately, it leads to catastrophic negative impact, let's say, across Africa. So what African risk capacity does is say, well, let's work with you as a country to profile your risk and your exposure to drought. Once you actually understand that risk exposure, you have, as a sovereign nation, to decide either to retain the risk within your budget so that when it happens, you can respond, or we can work with you to transfer the risk to the insurance market so that when you pay a premium and that particular disaster basically happened, it triggered in your system that you're actually eligible to additional resources off your budget. So your first response to saving lives is actually paid for through the insurance market. Now, what I just described to you, for us, it's not just a concept. We've been doing it for 10 years. We provided up to $1 billion worth of coverage to our member states, about $130 million of payout to countries in many disasters that we deal with. But more importantly, and this is the most important part, we protected up to 100 million Africans across the continent. And this is something that we take with pride at ARC, because it shows that our work has a human face, and that's the people we're trying to protect.
Thank you, DG. I will now open the floor. I think we've heard the director sort of summarizing how we are transiting, how we are translating commitments into actions and why we need to finance the entire climate change discussion. May I see by show of hands any media that wants to pose any questions or clarification from the DG? We have one hand there. Any other hand in the room? Great. Let's start with you, and then. Do we have the roving mic? Great. Your name, your media house, and your question, please.
Thank you very much, Engineer Mr. Ibrahima.
Yes.
I'm Yvonne, and I'm from L24SA. I've got quite a couple of questions, but maybe I'll start with two. You spoke about the international community being committed to helping with the funding for the Africa's disaster response. Firstly, who are the people exactly behind the funding when you speak of international community? And then also, I wanted to find out, do you believe in climate change? Is it a reality or is it a hoax? I mean, there are many incidents that have happened lately where climate change really has become a trending topic. There's global warming, global cooling, global boiling. It changes depending on the situation, I suppose. But I want to give an example why I would actually ask if you believe.
Yvonne, sorry, may I interrupt you? The interpreters cannot hear you. May I kindly ask that you speak from this mic?
Do I have to start again?
Please. They could barely hear you.
I remember it.
I think I do. Thank you very much. Okay. I was saying thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Yvonne Katsande, and I'm from L24SA.
Right.
So you spoke about the international community being committed to helping Africa with the disaster response program. So my question was, who exactly are the funders from the Western community? Then I asked, secondly, if you believe in climate change as a reality, especially pertaining to Africa, or is it a hoax? The reason why I ask is because I could give an example. We had fires in Maui, Hawaii, that really seemed very strange, in the sense that you had houses that were literally burnt to ashes, but we had trees that were still standing and green. Other houses were targeted, other houses were not burnt. And I'm an investigative journalist, by the way, the reason why I ask, I do follow stories like that very closely. And we've had global cooling, we had global warming, global boiling, but there's not sufficient data to support it. And we've also had experts coming out. The owner of the Weather Channel himself came out and said, whether climate change is not a reality. The Earth is made in such a way that it replenishes itself. It changes but still maintains what it has to, what is favorable for the human being. So I wanted to know if we on the African continent really believe if this climate change is a reality or it's a hoax. Thank you.
Well, I'll come back to the hoax question. Of course, I believe in climate change. Otherwise, I won't be doing this job. But let me start with the first one. Basically, there's a process, and the process is that to recognize, as I said earlier, Africa contributed less than 4% to climate change. So therefore, the international community bears some responsibility in supporting Africa and other developing countries in dealing with the negative effect of climate change. So I think that's the starting point. Based on that, it's not just the developed country, it's also developing countries, the China, the India of the world, will contribute to climate change, whereby at COP28, and I can give you the details if you want afterwards, there is a long list of contributions that come from different sources. So the $600 million I mentioned earlier came from contribution from the EU, from the US, from Dubai, from also other countries around the world, and that is a way of recognizing that we need to talk the talk and also walk the walk. And I think that amount obviously is expected to grow. So hopefully the sources will come from different, the funding will come from different sources with the hope that we can convey that the role and responsibility is such that contributions have to come from those who contribute the most to climate change. I think the message I've been putting across is not just about money. We've seen existing climate fund that have been around for 10 years, where the accessibility is so dire to the extent that the Africans are complaining that accessibility and availability and affordability of these funds has to be such that once the commitments are made, we make sure the money actually gets to where it's needed the most so that we can get to supporting resilience on the continent. And that's why at African Risk Capacity, in fact, we've initiated something which we're very excited about in May to organize the first post-COP28 roundtable. And the idea is to bring different players around the table to look at the state of demand, the lessons that we learned, so that the money can be directed exactly where it's needed. So it's not just about funding, it's about where does the fund actually go to so we can build resilience. I think when it comes to climate change, obviously there are different theories in terms of hoax or not. But in Africa, we tend to focus actually on the human face of that extreme weather conditions. And I think that's basically the way we look at climate change. Extreme weather condition is not getting better, it's getting worse. And the fact that it's getting worse is reflected by the number of drought that we see in the Horn of Africa, the tropical cyclone we see in Madagascar, and the flood we see in many countries in Africa. And all of those disasters combined have something in common. They affect the most vulnerable communities in Africa. And that's why the African Union takes this very seriously. Of course, there is different discussion at technical level in terms of the whether climate change is reality or not. Now, I do recognize, if you look at, for example, food insecurity in some countries in Africa, it's not just caused by climate change, it's also caused by war or maybe instability in some of these countries. So we need to look at that holistically. But in the meantime, I think we should not say just at the level of hoax, we have to look at, obviously, the fact that this is affecting many countries in Africa and people in particular.
Thank you, DG. Do we have any more questions from the floor? We have one hand here. Any other hand? Yvonne, you want to come back? All right. May we start with you? Maybe you come speak to the mic so we can hear you, and then we'll take Yvonne. Your name, your media house, and the question.
Hi, my name is Rutendo Matinyarare. I am from LLN24 SA. And my question to you, DG, is your organization also looking at cause and effect or causality? Because if we're looking at cause and effect, then we also have to ask the question to say, if Africa is going to have to jump on the bandwagon to manage climate change, how is it that the same Europeans who caused the climate change are running away from the green technologies they were using, going back to using coal? And as they do that, they put pressure on countries like South Africa to stop using its own coal, while they are importing that very same coal, only for South Africa to go without electricity, and many other African countries suffering the same. How do we deal with that cause that is causing the effect that we Africans are expected to manage differently to everybody else? Next question I wanted to ask, talking about cause and effect again, if a lot of famine is happening on the African continent because of climate change, but we had foods and grasses and types of grains that we used to grow back in the days that could resist and adapt to this climate change, why are we allowing the importation of hybrids that are not African and that do not adapt to the climate to become our central food sources like maize, instead of going back to our traditional seeds that would have adapted, could have adapted, but are not adapting because we're using hybrids that are being fostered and forced onto the continent to give business to corporations in the West?
Right. I think it's really important to underscore that in the business of climate change, there's so many players in Africa. We happen to be one of them. Starting with the African Union, and that's the reason why I said earlier, the climate summit that I held in Nairobi was a way of saying these are the concerns of Africa, including looking at the cause and effect, to the extent that we actually can situate the responsibility where they lie when it comes to climate change. And I think that's something, a leadership that the African Union is taking. That's the reason why they held that conference in Nairobi, and they will continue to do so. Second type of players, there's what we call the African group of negotiators. So when they actually discuss climate change, actions, and commitment, they make sure also this concern that Africa raised actually brought to the table of negotiation, so that at least we make sure when there's any statement, the African concern are also taken into account. There are also organizations like the African Development Bank that's very keen on food security, is also pushing an adaptation and so on. So my point being, we're not the only players when it comes to dealing with the African perspective. But the mandate we've been given is what I said earlier. If you look at climate change, it's what I call the human face of climate change. And that is when there's a drought, for example, in the Horn of Africa or in West Africa, we don't focus actually on cause of effect. We look about the people that are actually dying because of that food insecurity. When you look at, for example, tropical cyclone in Madagascar, when the school actually destroyed, we don't see them talk about cause and effect. We talk about the impact it has on the school and the people of Madagascar. So our mandate is say, how do we make sure, knowing the extreme weather conditions is getting worse, the impact it has on the most vulnerable people, how do we help our countries to anticipate through early warning systems? How do we help them to actually plan better and prepare themselves? But more importantly, to develop innovative financing so the first reaction is actually funded through whatever mechanism is available, in this case, insurance. So it's really important to understand that focus really bring climate change to the level of what I call human face of climate change. And we can't actually forget about that aspect, and it's extremely important. It does not necessarily mean that we're not involved in the global discussion about who's responsible, who's not. And this is certainly something that's going to go on for quite some time. But the extreme weather conditions is here, affecting many Africans, and it's really our responsibility to get involved. Now, some of the choices that you talked about in terms of resilience, these are also conversations that are taking place, particularly when they come to agriculture. And that's the reason why I'm delighted, actually, on the 18th, I've been asked by the government of Ethiopia to actually moderate a presidential conversation about smart climate agriculture in Africa. I'm sure this conversation, the point you raised, we're part of the discussion as well. I'm happy to ask that question to one of the presidents on your behalf.
All right, thank you, DG. Yvonne?
Well, thank you so much, DG. It's me again, Yvonne from LN24
Welcome
SA.
back.
Thank you. So, am I correct, though, before I establish my question, am I correct in saying that the humanitarian aspect of the climate change that you look into is dealing with the food shortages that come with the climate change and also shelter? I'm correct in saying that, right?
Not necessarily. It's not a one-size-fits-all. When you talk
Okay.
about drought, tropical cyclone, and flood,
So
they're
you
not
need
the
to,
same type of disasters.
yeah, so you need to provide shelter for the displaced and all that.
Not necessarily. We'll go ahead with your question. I'll answer. Okay.
So my question then would be, well, as far as I'm concerned, climate change brings with it a lot of ugly things. Number one, in the sustainable development goals that you speak about, you did speak about funding, but if we look at Europe as a style or an example of how they are dealing with climate change, they have climate tax that they have introduced to the people. How is Africa going to deal with that? Because it seems like we're taxing the same people that are also affected by the climate change, but we're trying to help people get out of the climate change disasters that come with it. That's number one. And then in terms of maybe giving the displaced shelter, what kind of shelter would this be? You spoke about smart agricultural systems, if I'm correct in saying so. There's also smart cities that come with that. The word smart there becomes questionable. 15-minute cities, is that a solution? Is that viable for Africa? Does it not also come with some sort of like totalitarianism in terms of ruling over people? The sovereignty, the freedoms of the people, are they not taken away by trying to resolve the climate change issues?
Right. All right, great questions. Let me just, it's important really to describe a business model as an organization, because the member state that we work with are really at the center of what we do. So it's not just ARC going to a country and say we're going to put money into shelter and other places. So the way it works, basically, once we profile the risk of a country, let's take, for example, drought or tropical cyclone, and the government decide they want to transfer the risk to the insurance market, then the question is, if actually it triggered that particular risk, and you're about to get a $10 million, for example, to help the countries to deal with resilience in the country. So before actually the funding is available, we sit down with the government and come what we call an operational plan, whereby the government will say, if I get $10 million, this is what I'm going to spend the money on. So you don't actually wait till you get the money and begin to say, what are we going to do with the money? With the risk the money can actually get into the public coffers in some cases. So that operational plan really helped the government to at least agree with us where the resources will be dedicated to, so we can protect the life and livelihood of the countries or the people that we are trying to protect. And we don't actually stop there. We also make sure that the funding actually go to a dedicated account, entirely dedicated to supporting the people that are actually affected. We don't even stop there. We go the extra miles and come in with the monitoring and evaluation process, where we can come back down the road and just basically do an evaluation and making sure we can show accountability and impact in the country, where actually the money actually generated to our system, our insurance market. So to your point, for example, in the case of tropical cyclone Madagascar, the government decided, for example, to spend money in rebuilding schools in some cases, dealing with some of the shelters so they can protect people who are actually affected by tropical cyclone. But that process is very interactive, participatory with the government, because our intention is to build the capacity of the government to do it themselves, not do it with ARC all the time. And I think in the long run, we hope that the government actually can be able to do that on their own. Now, with regard to tax in terms of climate change, now it's also important to recognize what we, for example, put to the table to a country. It's not the only response that the government has to dealing with climate change. It's part of the response. So therefore, we encourage government to develop their own contingency planning, their own climate resilience kind of funding, that what we provide come as a complement to actually what the government does. So if a government decides to be creative, innovative, using taxes, for example, general resources, obviously it's something that we support. But what's important, that humanitarian intervention, the way it's been done on the continent for a number of years, you wait till it happens. By the time actually it happens, it's too late and you lose life. And our intention to make sure no one is left behind. And I think that's the innovation of what we do.
Thank you, DG. I don't see any more hands from the press, so I think we'll call it a wrap. We want to thank you very much, Director General of the African Risk Capacity, for sharing your insights with us, and to the press for your active participation. And again, the conversation doesn't stop. It's conversations that we keep having during the summit and even beyond that. What you'll also find interesting is that the next briefing that is coming up in the next couple of minutes will continue the discussions around agriculture, climate change, and so on. So let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to find all the updates on what's happening at the summit and the discussions we're having at the African Union on au.int. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask one important question before, because
Will you please?
We're dealing with disasters that are caused by extreme weather conditions. And that is drought, and that is tropical cyclone, and that's flood. In some cases, we're looking at outbreak and epidemic. So all these disasters combined have a human face that's the impact on the most vulnerable communities, and that's what we deal with. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other disasters are not important, but we're very focused on what we do as an institution. Climate change.
All right, thank you, DG. Thank you for indulging us and for the clarifications. Again, we thank you for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure was mine. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.